the divine peace, light, blessings, grace, and guidance of God, of Allah Almighty, be with you and with us all. This is Ihsan, and this is Soul of Islam Radio. We live in incredibly unusual times and in an increasingly complex and confused world. The noble and blessed Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and upon all the messengers and prophets of God, stated that such a time would come in which good would be presented as evil and evil as good, a time in which all would be inverted, and that only with the light of faith, humility, and sincerity would a believer be able to discern truth from falsehood. With modern culture accelerating towards total freefall in complete chaos, and with modern culture collapsing and imploding from within, it is up to us as believers to begin again taking up the mantle of responsibility to lead towards goodness and towards God. In truth, as servants of the Most High and as a community created to enjoin what is good and prevent what is evil, we have reneged on our responsibility and our mandate and can no longer sit idly by while the world continues to descend into disorder and madness. There is a story from within our tradition in which Allah Almighty commanded the destruction of a society due to their persistence in iniquity and corruption, and the mighty angels of God set out to execute His divine order. However, upon reaching the town destined for destruction, they found a pious man praying and worshiping God in solitude. They then returned to the presence of Allah Almighty and said, "Lord, there is one of your servants still amongst them." Allah Almighty then responded to the angels and said, "Begin the destruction with his house." Since my original interview with Jamil Popatia in Season 4 of Soul of Islam Radio, in which we discussed compassionate and non-violent communication, he and I have become good friends and have stayed in contact and communication ever since. The topic which has tended to increasingly come up in our conversations is that of the loss of sacred masculinity and the loss of the way of spiritual manhood and chivalry in the modern world. In recent discussions and with the ever-accelerating chaos of contemporary culture, we felt it was time, and in fact long overdue, to begin sharing this conversation with our community. And so, in this episode of Soul of Islam Radio, I invite you to join Sidi Jamil and I as we discuss this critical topic and the necessity for men within our community to again remember who we are and rise to meet the unique challenges of our time in service of our Lord and Creator and in the service of our families and communities. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, following is our discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Brother Jamil. It is good to have you here with us again. It's wonderful to see you, wonderful to connect. And I'm really excited about this episode for our podcast, for Soul of Islam Radio. Now, for some of our listeners who may recall, we actually did an interview with you. We did an episode with you a few years ago on the topic of nonviolent and compassionate communication. So you and I have become good friends since then. We've always been in touch. It's been wonderful to stay connected, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, especially because this is something that's been coming up quite a bit for us. So welcome, Sidi Jamil.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Sidi Ihsan. Thank you very much. What a warm welcome. Yes, I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. I think it is absolutely in line with our times in terms of a discussion that needs to be had, as was nonviolent communication, aka compassionate communication. And, may our conversation here benefit our listeners, those who benefit from us, and ourselves.
Earlier we discussed about, mashallah, we took a moment just to set the intention for this. And this is one of the things specifically that came up for me, that this conversation be benefit to our ummah, to be benefit to our community and benefit to ourselves. So, Sidi Jamil, for our listeners and our viewers who may not be familiar with you and your work, maybe just if you can give us a quick background about yourself. Now, you're involved in coaching. You do coaching for men, and you do, you're certified NVP practitioner, or NVC, nonviolent communication. But just give us a quick background about yourself, and then at the end of this too, we'll let people know how they can reach you.
Sure. Thank you, Ihsan. Yeah, it's not terribly remarkable, but I'll just give a sentence or two. What I spend my days doing is I have a role of a counselor, a coach, a facilitator, and trainer. And what you mentioned was my main forte, my go-to is nonviolent communication, compassionate communication. which I came across about 7.5 years ago now, maybe a bit more than that. And what I have done with it is use the basics of nonviolent communication, its premises, its strategies, everything about nonviolent communication, and the whole concept of compassion and empathy before those words became weaponized in our time now, and blended that with our spiritual tradition of Islam, Ihsan, and how to really bring those two together. And that's what I do with many of my coaching clients. My coaching clients happen to all be Muslim males, as you said, under the age of 40, most, actually all over 20. So between 20 and 40, and looking for a way to not only connect with themselves in terms of how they interact with the modern world as a Muslim, as someone wanting also compassion and empathy, but also how to be authentically themselves, which means for these people, since they are men, authentically men, despite all the, if you like, forces around them, around us, that are trying to suppress and repress that. So it's going against the forces of, a lot of what we find today as distasteful and unnatural and anti-human. We're trying our best to revive that through my work in nonviolent communication, coaching and counseling in that, as well as the workshops and seminars that I do in that topic, which are for a broader audience, not necessarily simply Muslim communities. So that's how I spend my time.
MashaAllah. And we'll make sure to have links to your site and to your contact beneath, in the show notes for this, and also beneath the videos that appear that we extract from this. So maybe that's a good place to start, Sayyidi Jamil, because we live in remarkably unusual and strange times. Throughout human history and throughout, let's say, spiritual history, Allah Almighty has revealed a way for human beings to live. And I think it's important for us to remember, what is the purpose of that, right? I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our Lord, our Creator, the one God, has guided humanity from the beginning through His prophets, through His messengers, and also through their companions. And it's important for us to remember that the goal of guidance is the happiness of human beings. It's the success and the health of human beings. It's harmony in the lives of human beings. Like Allah Almighty God is not in need of anything. So when He subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His mercy, out of His benevolence, out of His love for His creation, reveals guidance. And guidance is essentially trying to answer the question, how are we to live? How do we live? Both be happy, healthy, successful in this life, and also, it can be said more importantly, in the life beyond. So that's eternity.
Yes.
It is from His mercy. And so He reveals, He subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the Prophet ﷺ as rahmatan lil alameen. Mercy to creations. One of the meanings of that being the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the revelation, the religion that is coming through the Prophet, being the means of guidance for humanity for their own benefit. So in the context of this reminder, this understanding that guidance from God is for our benefit, we find ourselves now in a world which is doing its best to go as far away from the guidance of God, literally in the opposite direction, and with disastrous consequences.
Yes.
With disastrous consequences.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I point out, that one of the most basic, I believe there was a poet, if I remember this correctly, a Pakistani poet, who said that the paradise for a human being is their home or it's their family. Like the closest experience we will have to paradise on this planet is the happiness of your home.
Right.
This is not paradise, but the closest that we can experience that is harmony and happiness in the home. Yet so much of modern and contemporary culture is destroying happiness and harmony and health and peace and stability in the home. And at the root of this, in a lot of the discussions we've had, has come up the topic of, which is now everywhere, gender and roles, man and woman. I mean, the contemporary culture can't even define what a woman is anymore, let alone a man. And not only that, there's this active disparagement of manhood and traditional masculinity.
Yes.
It's portrayed as toxic. In fact, all tradition is portrayed as backwards, as toxic, as non-conducive, as if somehow now we in the 21st century know better.
Right.
Cultural evolution, thousands of years of cultural evolution to get to stable systems is now thrown out, and we're going to reinvent based on our own capricious thinking how we should live.
Right.
But at the root of this comes, at the root of this, I have realized, is this topic.
Mm.
At the root of it is manhood, masculinity, sacred manhood, sacred masculinity.
Right.
So I'm going to step back for a moment and let you jump in here, Brother Jamil.
Well, I mean,
What are your thoughts on this idea?
it's a lot. It's a wonderful opening, Ihsan, and it's such a difficult topic to unpack in our time because our community does not seem all that interested in it. When I say our community, I generally mean the Muslims of our time, not only in North America, but you might say Western Muslims in general, though they differ between European and the UK, the US, and Canada. But let's use our context in the US and Canada. This conversation doesn't even seem like it's happening in our mosques, in our communities. And you and I, we've shared a frustration, a shared reality together of frustration of why this is not being discussed, why it's not being talked about. Whereas, when you and I both have a few grays to talk about, so we have the right to talk about this. 25 years ago, 25 years ago, we were probably looked at as the most conservative community on the planet. Very conservative, very traditional, and it was natural. Sure, there were problems in our communities, and just as there are now, but they're not the same. I think the post 9/11 mosque is quite a different place than what it used to be. And like you mentioned, the family home is quite a different place than what it used to be. And I'm not only talking about immigrant Muslims that have come to the United States and Canada in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and our period, but even Muslims in the East. Both of us, you and I, have lived in the East for some time. And we can see the shift that's happening there, unfortunately, is that what I think you nailed it when you said the very fact, the idea of a tradition is being undermined. In other words, I think Hamza Yusuf called it disdain for the ancients. Disdain for the ancients. Like, let's not tap into the wisdom of the people of the past. Instead, let's start fresh. Let's think anew, feel anew, and try to rebuild. The problem with that is the Muslims come from a tradition that is handed down generation after generation after generation from the first generation, which is the best generation of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So things only get worse with droplets of light throughout the centuries. But our grand situation seems to be the exact opposite of what today is called progress. And so what you said really hit home for me in that it's not progress for us at all. And it's not just us as Muslims, but anyone who has a tradition that they're trying to uphold or trying to live in an environment where tradition is looked at as something to be just thrown out, not considered at all, because it's not worth it and it's not helping. When this is particularly clear when we talk about gender and sexual roles, it's particularly clear that what women have been since the beginning, what men have been since the beginning, we want to change that up now. We want to change that up. As you mentioned to me a while back, men's job as protectors, providers, people to secure the family well-being, leaders, presiders, that is becoming increasingly rare. And so I find that to be very problematic in establishing family life and maintaining family life. You and I have personal examples that we won't talk about here that are so, we're friends, so we talk about it, but they're so common. Spend time with a man from the gym, from the mosque, from your work community, from your coaching clients, and you will hear the pain that a lot of men feel. This is not to say men are victims. This is not a victim's consciousness. This is a reality of that we're facing, which is we want to remain men. We don't want to be assaultive. We don't want to be, the term that I think you brought up, or this toxic masculinity. The two can't go together. Masculinity can never be toxic. Men can be sinful, but masculinity is praiseworthy. It's beautiful. It's part of being a full-grown man. Mm-hmm. And if it is done right, it is nothing but beautiful.
I'd go so far at this point to say it's sacred.
It's sacred.
Real absolutely. Masculinity is sacred, and it's
absolutely. I agree with that term, sacred. And where do you see it these days? I don't find it in places. There are maybe a few of our teachers that you and I have that we've traveled to visit. It's very rare. It's very rare, at least visibly to us. Instead, you and I get to hear the long list of complaints that young men have, whether it be difficulty finding a suitable marriage partner, whether it be difficulty in dealing with their parents, in choosing a career that cultivates their masculinity, sacred manhood, masculinity. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge that we help young men with, and yet we're in it. We're involved in it, living it. It's time to do something about it.
So I'd say, Brother Jamil, that
Mhm.
this is the challenge of our times.
Mhm.
This is the battle and this is the war of our times.
Yeah,
The spiritual war of our times is actually to reclaim
yeah,
real manhood and sacred masculinity.
right,
Because this is what is being assaulted by what we might call in religious or spiritual sort of parlance, satanic and djalic forces. Like
yeah,
this is the attack. All
right,
you have to see is what is being attacked continually
right, right,
by contemporary culture to see where the battle is. Like this is the battle line right here.
yeah,
And you said that, I mean, something you mentioned, right, that we want to be men.
hmm,
I take it even further and say, right, it's not about, and this has been my experience in life.
hmm,
It, I realized it's not about wanting to be a man, it's about the necessity of learning to be a man.
yes,
Like
yeah,
manhood is necessary.
right,
And when I look back at literally, every problem in my life, every
hmm,
failure in my life,
yeah,
right, and all the ways that that has manifested in all
hmm,
different arenas and dimensions and spheres of life, I can see it goes back to this
yeah,
manhood
yeah,
and not having learned how to be what a man is actually, how to
right.
be a man, right?
And I concur with you 100%. And it's too easy to get into the modern and postmodern phenomenon of blaming someone and say that we're victims of trauma
Mm.
or et cetera, et cetera. Our society is so messed up. So that's why we ended up with some serious struggles in young adulthood and now into middle age for you and I. But there's no one to blame. There's no one to blame. And there's only action to take.
Yeah.
And one knows what action to take only if one has an understanding of who one is and what's needed. Otherwise, it can become very chaotic and we can end up being the very thing that we dread, which is being oppressors or being indiscriminately violent or being, abusers in some way. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a sacred, as you called it, sacred masculinity, a sacred role of being men, which means moral leaders of our families, teachers of our families, heads of our families. And if our family is in good health, maybe our neighborhood will then be in good health because we'll be able to share some of our blessings and value. And then your town, your village will be in good health. And eventually you'll get to a community that's healthy. Society is nothing but a collection of communities. Right now, it's a collection of individuals with their own, as you said, satanic preferences of what they want. We've come to the point where we worship the nafs, the ego, so much that we think, no, if we want it, it must be good. If we want, well, sometimes what we want isn't good for us. We know that every religious community will tell you, train your soul so that it does not get everything it wants, is holds back self-restraint.
Mhm.
We don't teach self-restraint anymore. We don't teach to hold back. Only thing we hold back is anger. And even then, some of us fail miserably at that. I know I have.
Yeah, and that actually, so these are actually masculine qualities and
Yes.
traits:
Yes.
discipline, restraint, right? Asceticism,
Right.
control. These are masculine attributes.
Right.
They have their
Absolutely.
place in our lives. The feminine attributes have their place as well:
Yeah.
softness, compassion,
Right.
gentleness, surrender. Like these are feminine traits and qualities.
Right.
They're absolutely essential, necessary, but you can't have one without the other,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now, what modern contemporary culture is trying to do is create a world that is absolutely devoid of the masculine.
Right.
So there is no order, there is no structure, there is no discipline, there is no restraint, there are no lines.
Yes.
Like there are no lines. So there's no right and there's no wrong, to the point that everything loses meaning.
Right. It's complete nihilism. That's what I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
most of our clinical psychologists would call this a nihilistic tendency where your meaning is your meaning, Ihsan, mine is mine, and There's no community. There's no sense of collective. And that's not to attack individualism or individual preferences around certain things, but to not have a collective ideal to adhere to and to aspire to. Then what's the point of having a religion? What's the point?
Right, and the point is this aspiration towards truth.
Right.
So this mindset that everything is subjective and relative is
Yeah.
actually an affront. It's an assault on truth, because
Right.
truth is not relative.
Right.
Right? Truth is not subjective. Truth is truth, and
That's
we are
it. Capital
supposed to
T.
aspire towards that.
Right.
But so what contemporary culture essentially is doing is removing God
Right.
and putting in the place of God the self.
Because what is ultimate truth? Allahu Haq. That God is the ultimate truth.
Allahu Haq.
That's
Allahu
it.
Haq.
That is
Allah.
it. There are people of faith communities, not our community in the Muslim communities, but other faith communities where they don't believe that they're on truth. Capital T, as you mentioned. They just say this is what's been handed down to us, and so we're trying to do it. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, we're required to know the truth, to try to discover the truth and pursue it and then live it. Some of our teachers have told us, and you as well, I know he has told you as well, you can't be a seeker forever. Once you find, now act on it. Act on what you're found. And if you have found God, God has found you, it's time to act on it, which means complete surrender. It doesn't mean surrender to what suits you or what is in line with the sensibilities you were brought up with or what your family accepts. And this is where you mentioned there's no more masculinity. I would even argue that there is, but it's in the wrong gender, that our women have become masculine.
Yeah.
When I say our women, I mean women of our time, of all walks of life, cultures, religions. Perhaps ours is quite an inflamed example, our Muslim community. And this is what troubles me the most, is the loss of femininity that accompanies the disappearance of masculine men.
Right. And incredibly, I mean, these two are in sync, right? These
Right.
two are deeply connected. And so earlier you said, right, there's nobody to blame. We can say there's nobody to blame, and this is the reality we have to deal with. But I would actually at this point say that the bulk of the responsibility here actually lies upon men.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If men did not abdicate their manhood
Yes.
in the world and in our community in general, right, in the dunya that we live in, if men did not abdicate their roles, their responsibilities, what they were created to be, I mean, I don't think that this whole feminist movement and ideology would have gotten as far as it has. So I would say actually that there is a far greater level of responsibility on men to wake up and to awaken. And, we're actually seeing this in other communities, beginning to see the beginnings of this within the Muslim community, because now people are beginning to talk about manhood, masculinity.
Right.
The topic of
Right.
futuh is now back in the foreground.
Yeah.
But this is really now beginning to take off in the Western world and sort
Yes.
of in other communities. And you're seeing this revival and this resurgence to tradition,
Right.
traditional norms, and to manhood and masculinity. And this is a very common now topic. It's all over the internet at this point.
As you recall, and I know you went to a conference related to this topic, a 3-day conference, which I wish I could have gone with you on that. But we seem to follow. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ said that you will follow the Jews and Christians even if they enter a lizard hole. He didn't say Jews and Christians. And one of the companions asked, "Do you mean the Jews and Christians?" And he said, "If not them, then who?" In other words, what they do, you do. So when we realize now that the West, they lost so much when they gave up their Abrahamic religion. They were built, Anglo-Saxon societies, ours, for example, is built on Christian values. We can't deny that. Protestant Christian values. And they were very firm. Maybe you could say 1959 and before, they were very firm. They had some issues with it. And in the last few decades, have dropped it almost entirely to nothing. And what has happened is now, as we follow the patterns that are around us in the West abandoned religion a long time ago for the most part, even the United States, which is a more of a religious society than Canada, but even in the United States. So as they try to revive something in their religious life, and for the most part, I think the country's still a majority Christian country, majority Protestant country. When they try to revive this, that's when Muslims say, hey, maybe we ought to revive our tradition instead of being spearheaders, forerunners, to start these conversations and say, we didn't lose what you all lost. We just put it aside. But since you're not following yours, we're going to just take the secular route as well and fit in. I told my brother the other day, and I'm telling you now, Sidi Ihsan, we should be suspicious of Muslims who fit in unhealthy societies. If we fit into a very unhealthy society or community, the problem is not the community or society. Why are we fitting in? Mm-hmm. One of our teachers in Cambridge, what does he say? He says, we're the last antidote to modernity. We don't fit in nicely. We're an antidote to it. That to me makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. I mean, why would we even be trying to fit in? Or why are we taking this apologetic route?
Yes.
And what happened to you are the best of nations raised for mankind? You are the ones enjoining good and prohibiting evil. And now you can see, it's incredible to me that percentage of the Muslim community is, just going along with all of the contemporary craziness.
Because there aren't conversations like the one we're having right now. Some of our scholars right there in Northern California, where you are saying that we've never had people leave Islam in the kind of numbers we have now, leaving Islam. This is not Western Muslims. These are Muslims coming from the heartland of Islam. Where there's war, where there's tyranny, where there's difficulty, financial, economic difficulty, and people are leaving Islam because they don't see it as an answer. We have to take responsibility for that. We haven't given them an answer. Instead, we've said, follow the West. West is all right, doing what they do. And this dichotomy of West and us, it has to stop, because like you, like myself, we're both from the West Coast, born and raised. We are influenced by the culture we live in. We may have roots that are east of the Atlantic, but we still are born and raised here on this West Coast soil that you and I are from California to Vancouver here. And we take that into consideration when we implement, when we learn, and when we try to live our tradition in our environment. But we have to know, there's a Caribbean saying that says, better the enemy you know than the friend you don't. So our enemies are those who are promoting things that are absolutely inherently antithetical to the message of God and prophets. And that is, you mentioned it, the transgenderism, extremist feminism, feminizing of men, the loss of traditional values and gender roles. Islam is flexible regarding gender roles, but there are some non-negotiables. A man cannot say, I don't want to be the leader. It might be hard. It might be difficult, but you have no choice. You're the provider, and you're the one that needs to lead your family morally down the path of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we're celebrating his birth, his life, his mission right now in this month, Rabi al-Awwal. And so we should remember that he was a compassionate, gentle, merciful leader that had a warrior side. We have suppressed that about our modern Muslim communities. We'd rather suppress that because it's unpopular in our time, and that's unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate, and so that may be the next sort of thing that we might want to discuss a little bit is the reality of how unfortunate this abdication of responsibility is, right? What are the results of this? I mean, I can see left and right divorce at an all-time high within the Muslim community, right? Let alone the general community who's not even getting married anymore. And that's not really an option for Muslims.
Yes.
But amongst non-Muslims, marriage is a thing of the past. And they're talking about now population implosion, population collapse in most Western societies, because not only are people not getting married, but they're not having children.
Yes.
Right. So, and the ones that do get married, I mean, the divorce and the catastrophe of divorce is so high.
Right.
That's one reason most people are just not even willing to risk it anymore.
Right.
But now we're beginning to see this in the Muslim community as well.
I think we are seeing it. I mean, we won't get into personal examples here of brothers we know and ourselves, but we know this phenomenon experientially. And so we have the right to talk about it. We've walked through this path. We know it. It's painful. It hurts. And in my work as a family counselor, I need to be up to date with stats and things like that around these issues of separation, divorce. It's very heavy stuff. Between 75 and 90% of all separation and divorce in the United States, and Canada's very similar numbers, is initiated by the woman, by the wife.
Yeah.
So what do we deduce from that? What's going on? It does seem that, it's not that long ago where even in the West, women didn't have the right to a no-fault divorce. That's what we call a no-fault divorce. Just, I fell out of love with you, I'm not feeling you anymore, and we got a divorce. It's not that long ago where that would be unheard of. The right of divorce was generally in a man's hand, which we must admit, he didn't use very much. And men tend to prefer. This has been I can speak anecdotally about my experience in counseling families and couples. It seems men generally want to stay in the marriages and the women want out. I don't know about our own Muslim community if that's the pattern with them, but I wouldn't doubt that it is. I mean, you may know more since you work a lot with our people?
Well, I don't have a statistic, but I do see the same mindsets, the same sentiments within the Muslim community that you see in the larger community,
Right.
because the same ideas have now filtered into I mean, everybody's now basically in the same ocean.
Right.
You don't have those clear lines of, Darul Islam and Darul Harb. It's all, like you
Yes.
said, it's all one big sort of pot. And
Yeah.
this is one of the issues I have with a lot of our scholars that don't talk about the issues that are plaguing humanity, that don't address these issues, and they just confine themselves to matters of fiqh and aqidah and so
Yes.
on, right?
Yes.
And these sort of these academic disciplines. But the average person, I said this to you recently, the average Muslim is not suffering because, and really suffering profoundly, because they don't know how the fiqh of wudu, right? Like all the little details of wudu, or of the aqidah, or of
Yeah.
anything, right? They're
Yeah.
not suffering because they don't know how to wash a dead body,
Right.
the fiqh of
Right.
that. They're
Right.
suffering because their homes are in turmoil.
Right. So our crisis, if I hear you correctly, is a spiritual crisis, not an intellectual one. Although I'd say it's both, really. But I mean, we have scholars alive in the United States and Canada that are very high-level scholars in Islam. But what we don't have are very content, meaningful, spiritually alive homes. We have robotic, formulaic, mechanical homes where people are doing their duties to the minimum, but nobody's content. Nobody's happy. This is your average. One of the sheikhs said to completely pass over middle class Islam in North America. And I didn't know what he meant. I know what he means now. I know what he means. And this phenomenon of we'll just live like Westerners, but we're Muslims. Doesn't work. We are Westerners and we are Muslims, but our way is not a way of worldly comforts, worldly pursuits, to the extent where spiritual life is just maybe for a Sunday class with this scholar, this imam, or maybe even for the traditional minded for a Friday night dhikr, for example. And then they go back to 6 days of misery and pain and difficulty with their spouse, with their children, with their work colleagues, and they're void of meaning. That's really sad. It's very sad because we've lost meaning, and our meaning is derived through our suffering and through our experiences. As Viktor Frankl said in his book, said you have the ability to interpret what's happening. And if you interpret it with a type of bitterness or why is this happening to me, as many people would say who are in hardship, then you don't get to actually derive meaning from it. And we are in this position, you and I and many men and women out there too. We often, in these discussions, Ihsan, we tend to forget women are suffering. Women are suffering because of us.
Women are suffering profoundly.
Exactly.
Right, by the metrics, and there are statistics and there's data on this. You mentioned it doesn't work for us, like, to live just like typical Westerners.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It doesn't work for them either.
It doesn't work for them.
Right? It's not working for them either, because that's now sort of contemporary culture again has taken a purely materialistic, faithless, godless path, and it doesn't work for anybody.
Right. Even if you go to church on Sunday, absolutely.
And in Islam, we fully recognize, right, revealed religions.
Right.
You don't have to be a Muslim to be at peace or content or have a faith-filled life. You can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, a follower of any of the prophets of Allah.
Absolutely.
And it's acceptable. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the West has left that altogether now. Mm-hmm. And so now going back to results, right, we are seeing unprecedented levels of unhappiness, stress, anxiety, depression. Mm-hmm. And it's higher in women than it is in men, actually. Yes, statistically, right? Majority of women are far less happy now than they were 50 years ago.
And look at the difference. I mean, that stat is amazing what you just shared. And, world-renowned clinical psychologist, Dr. Jordan Peterson, talks about this, saying, if progress is supposed to promise us such happiness, joy, and contentment, well, you just mentioned 40, 50, 60 years ago, there was a big difference between the lives of women then and the lives of women now. And they're in every profession, in every field, in every endeavor. They have infinite choices in front of them as a young woman. And in the past few decades ago, let's go 1959 and before, that wasn't the case. And yet you just mentioned that they were much happier then. So where's the progress if more options, more wealth, more opportunity, more shiny things from the world are available and you can get them, and it still doesn't bring joy, meaning, happiness, then we're doing something wrong. The problem is we haven't realized it yet in the West. It's starting to happen now. And because those in the so-called Muslim world just simply follow the West, they're not realizing it. And it won't be that they realize it until the West realizes it, because as usual, they follow instead of lead. And that's the sad reality. Our population globally has become so insignificant. We're 1.8 billion in the world. Look at that number. That's a lot. And we're really insignificant because our religion has become secularized, and it's become modernized, and it's become watered down to such a degree that it's almost equivalent to secular Protestant Christianity in the United States, Canada, Europe, elsewhere. It's a very small chunk of our week, our lives. It doesn't even affect us. We may say a prayer when we go to sleep. We may eat certain foods and not eat certain foods, and it doesn't go deep. It doesn't affect who I am as a man, who you are as a man. It's just relegated to very small margins. You feel me? What I'm saying?
Absolutely. We've lost the way, we've lost the path,
Yeah.
and we've forgotten who we are.
Yeah.
And I want to keep going back to this verse. You are the best of nations, raised for mankind, enjoining
Right.
good and prohibiting evil. It means you take a stand. It
Yes.
means you identify right and wrong, good and evil. And you try your best to align yourself with what has been revealed by the prophets and messengers of God.
Yes.
So let's jump back into this, let's dive into this topic, sacred masculinity, sacred manhood.
Mm-hmm.
What are some qualities and characteristics of that? What would you say, Jamil?
Well, I tend to want to quote from Sulami's book, Al-Futuwa, the book of Futuwa, the book of chivalry. So just what comes to mind in remembering that book is leadership, generosity, hospitality, a warriorship mentality. There's a type of preparedness, like a samurai might be,
Mm-hmm.
like any of the traditional cultures have a type of warrior preparedness to them. In other words, if things happen, so physical strength,
Mm-hmm.
being articulate, having the ability to speak in a way that is assertive, authentic, and that you mean business. You're not easily pushed, influenced, and persuaded. You might even say that sacred masculinity requires from a man a little bit of disagreeableness.
It's
You
part
know,
of Jordan Peterson you mentioned. It definitely always
right?
points that out, that is a masculine trait,
Absolutely.
masculine quality.
This is not to say that women don't have that trait of being disagreeable, but in his famous personality test that he has given, it's done throughout the world, more men in the world globally across cultures and socioeconomic status are more disagreeable than women. And we've put a suppression button on that, as if it's okay to just be compliant. It's okay to be told what to do by authority, by our own parents, by whoever. Where what I think he would mention and has mentioned is there are times where disagreeableness is a fantastic characteristic and trait to have in the face of oppression, tyranny. And we're seeing that in the last 2.5 years.
It's
We're seeing
necessary.
it. Absolutely. It's necessary, because your home in your town, village, or city, if you're the only disagreeable man on that street, then people are going to rely on you when the enemy comes and the oppressor comes to harm you and your family, to get up and do something about it. It ought to be that the men and even women in all those households would stand up and say, not happening. You're not taking our homes or our wealth or our children, etc. So, disagreeableness is not something that is completely repression worthy. And we've fallen short on that because we've suppressed it as if it's somehow unbefitting. It's not befitting for us. It's not an attractive quality for a modern man to have. And that's not true. That's a shame. Hospitality, to be generous with people, not fearful. In other words, what's the opposite of that? What the modern man is stingy. I need to save from my this, that. I need to save myself, my time. Stingy when somebody needs you and you are stingy with them because you have a family or you have things to take care of. We all have wives, children, and homes and responsibilities to take care of. But when somebody calls on you, a community calls on you to be magnanimous with your time, that I recall reading over and over again in Futua about that practice, as well as so we talked about generosity and forgiveness. forgiveness and being a person of pardoning, to be able to pardon for yourself if somebody wrongs you, but to seek justice when someone you're responsible for is wronged. For example, your wife, your children, your community, if you're an imam or if you're a community leader, that you are quick to defend. Defend who? The weak, the oppressed, the marginalized, women, children. This doesn't seem to be commonplace anymore.
No. And if a man doesn't have this capacity, these capacities, if a man doesn't have, let's say, these types of strengths, then what value is he to his family, to his community? Right? What value is he to God?
I think one time you mentioned this three, and you may have taken it from another one of our brothers doing this kind of work. A man ought to be able to provide. A man ought to be able to protect, provide, and preside. I never forgot those three things that you told me, and I value them. And I want to give credit to whoever actually came up with those three, because that's a great summary of it. Really beautiful.
I think that's the motto from the Order of Man podcast.
Got it. Okay.
By I don't remember the guy's name, but also again, one of these really sort of incredibly successful and large podcasts and platforms that are now beginning to again discuss manhood. Unfortunately, it's not within the Muslim community, and this is something that we wanted to. This is the reason we're having this conversation. Yeah. We want to start this conversation within the Muslim community because we shouldn't be the last ones, to what's happening. Like, we should be at the forefront of what's necessary. And other communities are well now into this topic, and we're just beginning to sort of openly have this conversation, discussion. I want to share with you, I did a workshop with a group of men not too long ago, and we called it Awakening of Man. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that we asked there, what is a man?
Right.
So I don't know if people are familiar, but yeah. So one of the questions we asked is, right, what is a man? What are some of the qualities of a man? What are the roles and responsibilities of a man? I'm gonna just briefly go over some of the things that we discussed in this this session and this workshop. So roles and responsibilities, right? A man, we came up with this, definitely not exhaustive, but this list: a believer, a provider, a protector, leader, a guide, head of household, a vicegerent of God, a servant, a father, a husband, a son, a soldier, a warrior. And these are roles or responsibilities of a man. What are some of the qualities and characteristics of a man? Responsible, balanced, strong, dependable, prepared, competent, capable, persevering, connected, in control, boundaried, disciplined, firm, humble, merciful, compassionate, kind, faithful, focused, determined, decisive, clear, trustworthy. Is this not good for men and for women, for children, for society? I mean, is this not what we should be aspiring to be?
I believe so. And you and I are both fathers of sons. So I know you've been up late at night thinking about how to pass on something to your son of those qualities. And I have myself, and you have more than one son. So it ought to keep us up at night. And the task is not only how do I pass these beautiful qualities that your participants mentioned, but how do I retrieve them myself? And then as I do that, hope and pray that my son takes some of them with him on his journey.
Yeah. So this is at the heart of this conversation, Jamil.
Right.
The role of a father. In the West, or let's say contemporary modern feminist culture, has declared war on fathers, on patriarchy, yes. Right? The patriarchy, which is basically a war on fathers and fatherhood. And you can see throughout everything that we are constantly bombarded with, the disparagement and the diminishment of fathers and the role of fathers. Mm-hmm. There isn't any positive portrayal of men, and especially of fathers, in media, in movies, in serials, in shows, and nothing.
Yeah.
Men are constantly shown and portrayed as incompetent, weak, indecisive, incapable. They're useless.
They're disposable.
Disposable, exactly, absolutely. And then the question is now, right, how to pass this on to one's children? Well, there's only one way, and that's if we awaken these in this reality in ourselves.
Right.
And what we're seeing now is an entire generation, or maybe two generations at this point, being raised without fathers.
Yes.
In fact, when you look at the sort of the structure since the Industrial Revolution, the father has been increasingly taken away from the home and away from the children. Your fathers always work, but Usually, when a boy was older, you know,
You
reaching
join your
puberty and
father.
so
Yeah.
on, he would begin working with his father.
Right.
But since the Industrial Revolution, right, we have a situation where the work of fathers is completely alien to the children. Like they can't share it with their children.
Right. Right.
And,
Yeah.
and so there's
I'm
this
in that field
increasing,
myself. Yeah.
yeah, and so there's this increasing divide between fathers and their children, especially between fathers and sons. And you have an
Yes.
entire generation of boys that are actually never making the transition into manhood because they don't
Right.
have elder men, they don't have their fathers around to do that. And
Yeah.
even the ones that do, in many ways, the fathers seem handicapped or incapable, or they themselves don't know how to.
They themselves haven't had it. Right.
Yeah,
As the Arabic saying
exactly.
goes, فَاقْدُ شَيْءٍ لَا يُعْطِيهِ. He who does not have cannot give. Period.
Exactly.
And there's wisdom in that. And you mentioned something that's so critical, which for me, it's scary. It's because as we're divided, we're now divided from our sons during the day when we're working, when we're doing, for example, you and I, we work in a field which there's a great deal of confidentiality and privacy that clients share with us. We can't have our sons there as we would if we were carpenters, blacksmiths, etc. That's a tragedy in and of itself. But on top of that, if we send our kids to schools, be they quote unquote Muslim schools or public schools or private schools, 9 times out of 10, our sons are being socialized, educated, and trained by whom? By women. And so there's another feminization process happening right there. It's not to disdain, it's not to demean what the teachers are doing. She's doing her job, the female elementary school teacher or high school teacher. She's doing her job, but the environment is much more conducive to daughters.
Right.
Which is why you're seeing boys get in a lot of trouble at school. ADHD is far more diagnosed with boys. Aggressive behavior in schools is very quickly repressed and suppressed and disciplined. The boys are disciplined and girls are okay. That environment for a classroom suits them very well. Whereas the boys want to just throw mud balls at each other and get at it a little bit. Where can they do that? It ought to be with their fathers and uncles. Really, I don't want to sound too romantic, but it ought to be that there's a passing down of tradition. I think you and I both have sat with our beloved Imam who has talked to us about this and how it's completely absent, but it was part of his culture.
It's been part of every culture up until modern times, just a few decades ago.
Exactly.
And there's a great book on this too by, it's called, and you recommended it to me initially, in fact, Hold On to Your Children.
Hold on to your kids.
Hold on to your kids.
Yeah.
Right. And he talks about how there's been a shift from the vertical alignment of children towards their parents and ancestors to a horizontal peer-based. And again, it goes back to the entire system from education, right, where they're put into environments where they have to form these peer bonds for survival.
Yes.
But you're right. It's totally not conducive. It's not helpful. It's not a natural environment for young boys. And so you see boys checking out.
Yes.
Boys are falling behind and just checking out of the game. And they're just the one area where they can actually somehow even virtually be themselves is in a video game.
Right.
They can do masculine things. So they're all escaping to video games and so on. And they're checking out of life. They're checking out of the real world, unfortunately. This is a tragedy. I mean, this doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the boys, and it's certainly not going to help the women of the future.
I don't mean to out so many of our young men that you and I counsel, coach, and if you will, train even. But our young men are in trouble. Those between 20 and 35. We're talking people who are ostensibly, outwardly religious, being addicted to things like pornography, sometimes substances. You just mentioned video games, an incessant addiction to video games that just unhealthy. And these are men that are desperately wanting answers, and they're desperately wanting guidance and leadership. A 1 hour session a week with you or I is not really enough, right? And they have to pay for that. And oftentimes they have economic hardship, etc. And there's very little way that they can have the implementation with a mentor unless that's part of the program or they have someone as an accountability partner, etc., which, maybe we can talk about how we can set that up for people. But these are decent young men they feel completely useless. They feel like this society doesn't really need me. So screw it then. I'm going to continue with my addictions. And if this is the only place I can get some satisfaction, if you will, then I'm going to look at what I'm going to look at on the screen, and we know what follows that. And so that is so tragic. Why we've taken away so much of what makes youthful life good, which is what marriage. We're telling young men, don't marry until you have money, until you have a house, until you have a great career. So basically, your whole time when you're full of healthy energy, suppress it, because we don't. In our tradition, of course, there's nothing outside of marriage in terms of relations. And we're telling women, this is where I believe Jordan Peterson is bang on, where he says, if all we do is tell young 18, 19, 20-year-old women that your career means everything, then what happens when that 30, 35-year-old woman with frozen eggs says, I feel empty because no one wants to marry me and I can't have any children anymore, or at least it's difficult now. So this is the problem. We've given the wrong message to both men and women, young men and women, and we suffer for it.
And it goes back to, are we going to try to lead and guide ourselves? Or are we going to now humble ourselves and go back to religion and revelation, right? And we can, this experiment, we can take it as far as we want, but it doesn't seem to be going in a good direction.
No. And the warnings have come. I mean, part of religion is, it's not popular. Part of religion is a warning. Yes, there's a giving of good news and glad tidings, but there's also a warning that there's a path to take. You can take another path. It's not a safe one. Take the path of the prophets. It will lead you to the right place. And on the way will give you contentment, meaning, joy. It doesn't mean free of hardship. We need to emphasize that.
No.
But what man of any worth, I don't know if I should say it, but I have not met any man of any worth who has been through light or easy hardships. The best men I know have been through hell and back, excuse my language. They've had hardships, loss of marriages, loss of death of family members, loss of income, some even to the point of almost sleeping on the street. Men who have seen hardship, war, soldiers, veterans. These men have some substance to them, and they've earned their wrinkles. They've earned their grays, and they can pass on wisdom. Those of us who have been through a few nicks, ticks, and light hard hits, we don't have what it takes to pass anything on to our youth, to our young men, because we haven't felt the difficulty of life. And this, you talk about people in the realm of reviving manliness and sacred manhood. What do they talk about? Voluntary hardship, as simple as taking an ice cold shower in the morning. You might think this is, people listen to me say that and I say, maybe you want to try this for your mental health. They say, what? That's going to just shock me and make me feel, shiver and gross, and I won't feel well. I'll get sick. The health benefits of doing something that's difficult like that is tremendous. And it's a hardship that you put yourself through in order to make yourself stronger. Why do men like myself and others, we go to the gym and we use barbells and we put a bunch of weight on it, we squat it, we lift it, we press it, we push it. It's hard, and you risk injury and you get injured, but it's good. It's a voluntary hardship that we ought to take on. I even know a man who had he was a computer engineer, a Muslim, great opportunity to work for a company, but he had suspicions about how halal it was given the kind of company it was. He didn't have to do this. He voluntarily said, I'm going to take a warehouse job while I look for work. And he wasn't well built or anything. He was very slight build and lifted boxes for hours on end a day when he was a highly qualified software engineer because he had some doubt about the company that was hiring him. That's a voluntary hardship that he took on to say, I'd rather have integrity. By the way, you asked about qualities. Integrity is a big one. I would rather have integrity than to have doubt about what I'm doing. What happened to that? Really, it's a beautiful quality.
Yeah, it seems that unfortunately we've become too easily influenced to choose this world over the next.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's also, again, goes back to that sacred masculine, sacred nature that is willing to take on hardships and difficulties for the sake of truth, for the sake of God, for the sake of one's family. Right? That's how Allah built men.
If you don't take on some voluntary hardship, Ihsan, what happens when it reaches you and it touches you? Will you be able to hold that stuff on your shoulders?
That's the problem.
I think it was I don't remember who this said. Could be I don't recall. Put some heavy stuff on your shoulders now, by choice, before it's put on your shoulders by force. That makes sense. So, and oftentimes when I'm in the weight room and with the men, young men, there's a few middle-aged men. That's the energy that's there. Is this? Let's get strong, because in our lives of like for me, I work as you do. I'm in a very relaxed, peaceful, danger-free environment on my computer, working with people, in front of people, writing, etc. There's nowhere to let loose of this energy. And so we find places. Some do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and it's difficult. Some do serious strength training with barbells, and it's difficult. Others go to the shooting range because it's in us all. And if we suppress that, then there's not much left in us to value. We're just robotic. We look like men, perhaps, and some of us don't even look like that, going through life in a somnambulant state of, wake up, go to work, come back, watch television, get on the screen, do something. There's nothing vigorous. There's nothing alive. I mean, I'm not saying that we all have to be hunters and get out and shoot, but what we can do is at least do something difficult that is good for you. How about starting with a cold shower just to start your day? See what that does. How about in our context as Muslims, how about waking up a little bit early for some blessed time before the prayer time comes? Mm-hmm. How about going to the mosque?
Yeah.
Just getting in the car or walking or biking or whatever, even though you might not like all the brothers there. But the difficulty in doing it means it must be good for you. Or changing what you eat.
Yeah.
Men don't. It ought to be that men eat healthy foods so they can keep their body healthy for worship, for protection, and for longevity, because you don't just live for yourself. If you're a family man, you have a wife and children, maybe even more than one wife, plenty of children that you have a responsibility to provide for, protect, and to be there for them. We've lost that, and it's tragic, but I don't want to get too much into a bemoaning kind of grief with you, Ihsan. I want to work on how we're going to remedy this.
Yeah.
And I think people like you, I'm honored to know people like you, to be able to be numbered among your friends and many others in our community. We're not alone. We're not alone, but we need to do work together and recruit together and be in each other's presence.
Indeed.
Somehow.
Indeed.
They try to stop us from gathering, but we won't let that happen. We will gather. We'll be together.
And we must. And, this is, and likewise, Sidi Jamil, it's necessary to have good brothers and
Yes.
Good people in our lives that we actually make time to connect with,
Right.
to congregate with, and even to train with, right?
Yes.
To work with,
Yeah.
to struggle with, to suffer with.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what makes us men. It's what makes men men.
Absolutely.
It's not
100%.
going to be comfort and ease and indulgence and luxury and excess. It's going to be hardship. It's going to be some level of zuhud, some level of difficulty. And the reality is, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, with hardship comes ease.
Right.
With that hardship, with that discipline, you're going to find greater and greater ease in your life.
Yes. And for the listeners and viewers, it's not that we're not singing a song in praise of sadistic behavior or the seeking of pain intentionally. A'udhu billah. We're not supposed to do that, because the Holy Prophet ﷺ, if he had a path to take between two things, he would take the easier of the two, so long as there was no sin in it or wrong action in it. So we don't want to make extra difficulties for ourselves, but we want to prepare for difficulties that are headed our way, and they are headed our way. We can't avoid it. It's part of being on God's green earth.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to hit us, and let us be prepared. Of course, we call on Allah, Ya Latif, to put gentleness in it, so that it doesn't destroy us. But we also are prepared. We want to be prepared such that we can handle it and not be in the game of, why is this happening? Woe is me. Look at what I'm going through. Instead of worrying about why you're going through it, find a dignified way to respond.
Mm-hmm.
A dignified way to respond. Let's say you go through a divorce. A man goes through a divorce. It's very hard on a man. Or a loss of income, a loss of job, or a wayward son who's not on the path of Islam as the father would like. These things cause tremendous pain in the heart of the father, of the man, but they can be a source of growth if they're responded to with dignity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to thank you, Sidi Jamil, for the time, for the conversation, and maybe just bring it back to where we started, which is, what is the purpose of all of this? And ultimately, it's the health, the happiness of human beings. And I think that we're happiest when we are what God created us to be.
Right.
And when we fulfill those roles. And I think the first act of insubordination in creation that we have been told is the act of Iblis.
Yes.
Refusing to play the role that he was assigned.
Right.
And trying to through his own will, change what Allah had willed.
Right.
And so the religion before Allah is Islam. Inna dina indallah al-Islam.
Absolutely.
So,
Alhamdulillah.
and that's the path. It's not, again, Allah doesn't need it, but
Right.
it's what leads to our own happiness. But we have to learn to set our own egos aside
So,
and to also carry and take up the mantle of responsibility that has been given to us as human beings. May Allah Almighty guide us. This is I
mean,
wanted to have this conversation with you as a start to this conversation, as an opportunity for us to bring this conversation out into our community, and to broach the subject, inshallah. And God willing, good comes from it. That's our hope, that we can hopefully reduce a little bit of suffering in the lives
yes,
of our fellow brothers and sisters.
yes. I mean, to your supplication, Ihsan, and I think that this is just the beginning. I want to just insert one more point that I hope that we can take as we depart. This will not be warmly welcomed by everyone. We have to be prepared that there will be a lot of naysayers and many people who will point the finger at Ihsan saying, you see what Ihsan's talking about? He is saying all this and that. And many, many people online and offline will start the attacks. And they'll come to my website and they'll do the same thing. They will come to me in person and say, is it true that you're trying to revive something that we consider to be dangerous, like patriarchy? Well, everyone wants to simplify things to black and white. And so they look at things as patriarchy is bad. Everything modern and progressive is good. Men are bad. So women are good, except they don't get the fact that there's gray. Yes, there's aspects of historical expressions of patriarchy that are not healthy, and they're not from the way of Islam either. And so we're not talking about that. We're talking about a traditional Abrahamic patriarchy where men are leaders of families and their homes, and that women, we will say this with the utmost certainty, that women are submissive, coachable students of their spouse. And that's not popular. That's not popular because we're hyper addicted to the idea of an egalitarian relationship of equality. It's not to say that men and women aren't spiritual equals. Indeed, they are. But the fact is, the matter is that we're very different creatures. And that's why we match so beautifully. It's when one tries to be what one isn't. The masculinization of women, the feminization of man creates a destruction of the family. And that's what creates destruction in society. It's fairly simple. The fact that the Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have a similar family structure, very similar, means that we can all revive it. All revive it. And alhamdulillah, that in the way of Islam, everything we have is intact. Our tradition is preserved. It's just that we've put it on the shelf and say it doesn't fit us for this time. And that's our tragedy.
I mean, I'll go back to a couple of things here, just to wrap it up for us, Jamil. And that's that number one, first and foremost, men have to be competent and capable. Otherwise, they will very well devolve into tyrants, which they have throughout the world. And it's no secret that power is abused in many parts of the Muslim world. But that's incompetence, and that's a lack of manhood. That's a lack of masculinity, in fact. Number one. And number two, la ikraha fi din. We're having a conversation. And for those that Allah guides to, because this is the battle, this is the front lines of what is emerging as the battles of our times. And whom is seeking for guidance and knowledge and wisdom for one reason only, to live a simple, healthy, happy, harmonious life. Then may Allah guide them and guide us.
I'm
not interested in imposing any idea on anyone, and I'm sure neither are you, Sidi Jamil.
I'm not.
Everyone is free to choose to live as they like, but we want to have the conversation, and we want to have specific conversations for those that are seeking, and who have experienced and realized this doesn't work.
Right.
Like what we've been told our whole lives isn't actually working.
Yeah.
Not for us, not for our families, not for our children, not for our societies and community.
Absolutely agree. 100% with you on that, Ihsan. And in closing, I want to, as we depart and say to our listeners and viewers, it's not that we're saying, come back, young men, come back and learn with us, be with us. Let us go on this path of manliness together. We're also saying, come back, women. You have a fitrah. You have an aboriginal nature, and it matches us well when we're in our aboriginal nature, when we're in our primordial, natural way. And every traditional culture has been like this. So why are we trying to reinvent the wheel that way? We want the women to also have contentment and meaning. We can't live without you. There's a lot of talk that says that women say, oh, we don't need men. We don't need men. They're good for nothing. We will not follow that path. Women, we need you. Mm-hmm. We totally need you. You're the second half of that family. And it's through you that God has perpetuated creation. And so you're that much of a valued part of this discussion. Even though we haven't mentioned you much, women, this is your discussion as much as it is ours. And we include you in the sense that just as we're trying to revive something that seems to be lost, we would encourage and invite you to do the same. And if we can be of benefit, we certainly want to.
May Allah Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to what's best and to what's pleasing to Him, and open our hearts to following what He is leading and guiding us towards as human beings, to the fulfillment of our roles, our destinies, and our purpose as His servants. Sidi Jamil, maybe you can conclude and make a dua for us and for our community and for our listeners, and inshallah ta'ala we can take benefit from a dua at the end of this.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد صلاة تنجينا بها من جميع الأهوال والآفات وتقضي لنا بها جميع الحاجات وتطهرنا بها من جميع السيئات وترفعنا بها أعلى الدرجات وتبلغنا بها أقصى الغايات من جميع الخيرات في الحياة وبعد الممات. اللهم إنا نسألك فعل الخيرات وترك المنكرات وحب المساكين، وإذا أردت بعبادك فتنة فاقبضنا إليك غير مفتونين. آمين آمين آمين. We ask the Lord of the worlds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to bless us, to bless our gatherings, to bless our families, to bless our homes, to make men worthy of being leaders in our families, in our societies, in our communities. And we ask that Allah make women in tune with their natural disposition as mothers, as wives, as leaders of women and their children. And we ask that the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa ala alihi, the most beautiful nation, be restored to its place of dignity and its place of honor and nobility. And we ask this by the honor of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Bijah Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Al-Fatiha.
Ameen ya Rab. Allahumma ameen ala sirat al-mustaqim. Jazakallah khairun, Sidi Jamil. It's been a pleasure to connect.
Always with you as well. Always with you.
Inshallah. Thank you. And we'll have a link to your site and your info in the show notes for this recording.
Inshallah. Okay. That would be wonderful.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I humbly and sincerely hope you enjoyed and benefited from this conversation and episode of Soul of Islam Radio. You can learn more about Sidi Jamil Popatia via his website www.dignifieddialogue.ca. To further connect with me and to continue the conversation, please visit our new website at www.borderpoint.com. To your divine and eternal success.